Hi everyone, it's David Thompson again with Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines series. I'm joined today by Jeff Rosenheim, who is the curator in charge of the Department of Photographs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And Jeff's here to talk with us today about a brand new exhibit that is taking place at the Met, recently opened, on photography in the American Civil War. So Jeff, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, David. I'm delighted to be here.
If you wouldn't mind, do you think you could just start off by giving us a bit of a broad overview of what this exhibition is really about?
Absolutely. So I had this idea quite some time ago, about a decade ago, to look at the role of the camera during the Civil War. And, it played many different roles. A good documentation tool. They copied maps and other documents. It was a tool of portraiture. People they joined their regiments and enlisted and sat for their portraits when they got their uniforms. It was very involved in the campaigns of 1860 and 64, so the first campaign buttons illustrated with photographs are from the Civil War era. And also it allowed people to realize their own sort of dreams, kind of activist photography like Sojourner Truth, who copyrighted photographs in her own name and sold them to raise money for the cause, anti-slavery cause, emancipation, etc. And so the many ways in which the camera recorded the time, the social facts of the time, interested me. And of course, they're the great sort of foundational books in American photography, Gardner's photographic sketchbook and the volume put together by George Barnard of Sherman's March. So these were sort of part of the history of photography, and I had never seen a show that integrated ambrotype and tintype portraits, cartes de visite, stereo views, campaign buttons, all these different things. And the show is about that. It's about looking at this medium just 20 years old when the war began.
And where are you drawing all of these images from? Or are these just solely coming from the collections at the Met, or are you drawing from some other partner institutions?
Yeah, David, thank you. We have a very good collection at the Met. About half the show is from our collection, a little less than half. But it was not going to be enough. I had to rely on those great Civil War collectors who I know support you as well. The history of the Civil War was and is written about, collected by, discussed, analyzed, interpreted, and debated by often amateurs who are collectors and who are collectors of American history. They're academics and they're amateurs. They're people with metal detectors who are finding things, telling us stories, but also they're collectors of photographs. So I would say that there are many more private collectors than there are public institutions that have lent to the show. I traveled pretty far and wide, especially to try to balance the known with the unknown.
And you have already briefly hinted at it, but I wonder if you could elaborate just a bit further on what were exactly, we think of photography now, and maybe perhaps I'm a bit naive, but we think of it kind of somewhat in almost a static kind of way, whereas photography at the beginning of the Civil War, as you mentioned, only about 20 years old, and there's different, types, formats,
sure,
mediums through which people would experience it. I wonder if you could touch on that briefly.
Yeah, so when photography started in 1839, it's basically a French and an English invention. It comes to the States through Samuel Morse, the painter, and by the fall of 1839 and spring of 1840, people were making daguerreotypes. Those are images on a sheet of copper, silver emulsion, polished, made light sensitive, and put in a camera. It makes an object that's unique. The inheritor of the daguerreotype was the ambrotype and the tintype, and when the Civil War began, it was the sort of waning of the Daguerrean era and the beginning of the ambrotype and tintype era, which lasted through the Civil War and tintypes really into the early 20th century. So the show has many tintypes and ambrotypes, no daguerreotypes, but that was not the only way pictures were made. Those are unique objects that are on plates, tintypes on a sheet of iron, ambrotypes on glass. But most of the photographs of the war that survive, even the ones in volumes, were made on glass negatives, and they were large sheets of window pane that had an emulsion, a silver emulsion, coated, and they traveled in large cases and were put in cameras, like we put film in cameras, or we used to put film in cameras. We don't do that anymore. And those images then were printed in the sun. Obviously, it was before electricity, so They were large ones and small ones. The little ones, the small size ones, carte de visite, are just a 4 by 2.5 inch negative or image. And then the large plates, which were up to 12 by 15 inches, were also used by Civil War photographers. And in the show, you'll see everything. You'll see tintypes in period jewelry and brooches and other pins. You'll see campaign buttons with tintypes. You'll see albums with cartes de visite, and you'll see these large presentation volumes like Gardner's Photographic Sketchbook, which are huge. And so it's a many-splendored thing, this war, and this exhibition as well.
Now, in terms of a physical layout, was there a lot of thought put into how people would experience this and just how they're moving through this exhibition?
In fact, I must say that there's 11 galleries in the show. It's as large a photography show as we've ever done. It has a kind of epic sweep. It begins with a kind of overview of all these different types of materials we've just been discussing. And then it follows loosely, episodically, sort of chronologically, the nature of the war. But it follows the way in which the camera worked and also the way in which the armies, North and South, used the camera. And it's very interesting because I think the emotional tone of the exhibition is very interesting. Some galleries are very tight with portraits. Others have more landscape views. Some of the galleries are dedicated to a single artist like A.J. Russell, who worked for the U.S. Military Railroad and worked in a very specific way. Barnard, there's a whole room of Barnard's pictures. He worked for Poe and the topographic engineers in the movement of Sherman. So each room has its own thing. I have a room on stereo views. I have a room on Zouaves and Zouave portraits and how powerful those are. I have a room on medicine and photography.
And obviously, as part of the audience that you might expect coming to view this exhibition, I imagine educators would form a pretty sizable group, and perhaps student groups as well. What do you think educators and students alike could really garner from this exhibition? What could be a takeaway for them?
Sure. Well, I hope the school groups are coming in. We moved the show up to April. We opened on April 2nd so that it was not during the summer. The original plan was it was a summertime show because that's when the slot was in our schedule, and we worked really hard to move the show up, which was, I think, a really good idea because I think that this story, the story of American history, is the crucible of our sort of country. And it was a coming-of-age story. And I think as school groups, whether they're high school or middle school or grade school or, for that matter, university students, this was a cataclysmic moment in American history. And the Civil War looms large in the imagination of the public. And I think it does because there's this great visual documentation. These pictures tell many stories. And I think we live in a time, sadly, where there's danger around us. There's wars around the world, some of which the U.S. is involved with, some of which are not. But Civil War is very much a part of global conflict. And in a certain sense, it's been part of global conflict forever. This is a story that I think people will feel when they see this show.
Now, as curator, do you have a particular, as you mentioned, there's 11 different galleries. Do you have a particular portion of this exhibit or even an image itself that really is your favorite, one that you might want to highlight, or even just a couple that you might want to highlight for our viewers?
Sure. That's one of the harder things for a curator. Every picture you choose, I had 10,000 or 15,000 pictures I liked, and 5,000 I liked even more. And so it's like choosing a child, over another child. But no, for me, the story of the war is in its diverse expression. I'm very keen on this little carte de visite of Sojourner Truth, which begins, the viewers would see it in the first gallery. And one, because I think most people don't realize how small pictures can be that have power. Today many people have smartphones, and the images on our smartphones we take pretty seriously. They're not just collecting devices, but we use our phones as kinds of cameras. Well, the little picture of Sojourner Truth, she writes on the image, right on the mount, on the carte de visite facade, on the face, on the recto, as we call it. I sell the shadow to support the substance. And it's a very powerful statement. And she had been born a slave in New York State, and she became a free person, and she had an epiphany, and she changed her name to Sojourner Truth. And she traveled the country and spoke at conventions advocating anti-slavery activity, and she sold the photograph to raise money for the cause. The idea that that actual card was collected at the time and entered into the sort of currency of political thought is a very powerful thing, and it's a picture I think I hope people pay attention to. Her story is also unbelievable. She said at one of the conventions, I used to be sold for other people's benefit. Now I sell myself for my own. Very powerful sentiment, and the way that the camera is integrated into a sort of a political activist moment. There are also some great pictures that deal with medicine and photography. There's a room of mostly photographs by a fellow named Reed Brockway Bontecu. Most photography historians don't know too much about him, but he was the head of the Harewood Hospital in Washington. And at the end of the war, he saw lots of patients. He was the head surgeon, and he began to use photographs to record his patients as they arrived, after treatment, and upon release. And these pictures seem to have a lot of meaning for me, and I think many others, because the patients who are sitting for their portraits seem to believe that the attention of the doctor and the attention of the camera were both beneficial, that they're posing, leaving behind their likeness, believing that they are healing themselves in that process. And that's just a beautiful thing. But I also think some of the great pictures by Gardner and Brady and Timothy O'Sullivan, A.J. Russell, Barnard, those landscape views are the beginning of a tradition of American picture making that's outside of the studio. And we didn't have a landscape tradition really before then. And these great, great, great pictures, O'Sullivan's and Gardner's views of the unburied dead at Gettysburg, or Gardner's views of the unburied dead at Antietam. No one had ever seen pictures like this. And they were shocking then, and they're shocking now. So those are some of my favorites as well.
I'm sure it's a very hard question to ask you and to come up with a succinct answer to that one, because there are so many images.
Well, it wasn't succinct, but thank you.
but it pointed to the diversity, really, of the exhibit, it sounds like. Now, finally, you obviously are a very large museum. Are there any other plans during this sesquicentennial here of the Civil War for any other potential exhibitions pertaining to the Civil War?
Yes, there are. Concurrent with photography and the American Civil War is another show that opens in late May, and it's called The Civil War and American Art. It was curated by Eleanor Harvey at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and it opens to the public on May 28th. And is on view throughout the summer and closing on September 2nd.
Well, Jeff, I don't want to take up too much of your afternoon. I do want to thank you so much for sharing just a little bit about this exhibition that's now on. Again, that is Photography in the American Civil War, on at the Metropolitan Museum of Art through September 2nd. Sounds like something that everybody who is interested in the war, interested in photography, simply cannot miss. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that Jeff, in conjunction with the Met and with Yale University Press, put out a fantastic volume on this exhibit. And it's a really, really great read. And for those who maybe can't make it to the city to actually get to the exhibit, I highly recommend that you pick up this volume because it's simply fantastic. And it's got some wonderful images in it. But Jeff, thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we can maybe have you on again soon.
I'd be delighted. Just let me know. This is my first Skype, and I'm honored to have done it with you.